Welcome all. We're going to start the chatter for the early birds and won't start the official presentation here for a minute or so, but thank you all for coming. I was just looking at the news. It's good to have this presentation in the middle of a very large cold front in the United States because it does kind of showcase some of the concept we'll be talking about tonight. I was just seeing that PJM, which is the wholesale territory, comes into part of Illinois, stretches across the uh, East Coast. It's the largest wholesale grid operator in the country. Just issued a emergency um, order with concerns about the winter peak demand and their ability to satisfy it. And when you get a grid operator saying those things, that is very concerning. There's currently 500,000 people in the country without electricity. So very good time to talk about electricity issues and where we're at and some of the challenges. And so I think it'll be good. I hope you're nice and warm. I appreciate you taking the time out to discuss energy issues with us tonight. And Celia, should we get started?
Let's roll.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Nick Hylla. I'm the director of the Midwest Renewable Energy Association. We're going to be talking about um, energy and really focusing on kind of like local impacts tonight. This is a new outreach effort for us. This is our first virtual presentation, but we'll be giving similar presentations all over the Midwest, starting Wisconsin. So if you are a local official or want to ask a local official to host us, we gladly come to your township and talk about energy issues. And maybe you should hold that thought as we move through the presentation. Um, so get my slides to work here. Okay, yeah, MREA, many of you probably know us because you're on this call. We're a nonprofit member association and educational organization based in Wisconsin. We operate in 7 Midwest states. We have a mission to increase adoption of energy efficiency and clean energy across the Midwest. Much of what we do works in response to market issues, and we're committed to education. We're not an advocacy organization. We don't do lobbying. We do consumer education. And so we've worked really hard to put together a presentation that strikes kind of a really good balance here and that sets us up for a good discussion. So submit your questions and we'll start talking about it at the end of the presentation. So why are we here? We're going to learn actually about electricity markets and trends. We're going to start with the basics of electricity generation, energy efficiency, distributed energy resources like solar and storage. We're going to discuss issues, including large-scale solar development, data centers, nuclear reactors, other generation, and their local impact. We're going to identify some local opportunities, things that people are doing that are probably good ideas, and respond to your questions. So let's start with the realities. Electricity has been for a long time affordable with gradual and predictable price increases. This is changing. Most people don't understand the electric system and don't pay attention to electricity bills. These two realities are also changing. Electricity has been a closed system with limited options for participation by ratepayers or customers. This is also changing. And finally, historically, local decisions about electricity policy and investments have had limited impacts. This is also changing. We're going to discuss and provide some context for all of these realities in this presentation because the decisions we make today will have significant impacts on our communities in the future. And this statement has never been more true than it is right now. And hopefully you'll see that as we move forward. So our agenda today, we're going to overview the basics. We're going to look at the trends. We're going to apply what we know to a few relevant news articles, identify some opportunities, and we're going to talk openly about it. And I put this quote up here. We don't always have to agree with one another, but it's important that we learn to respect each other. We all share this electricity system and rely on it. And regardless of where we stand, some real important decisions need to be made. So time to have a nice open conversation. Okay, how do electricity markets work? First, like the basics, the grid. What's the structure of the grid? What are wholesale markets and how do they operate? Who owns it all? How is it regulated? And how are retail prices set? So let's dig in, get out your notebooks. As Celia said, your cup of tea. There will be a test. The electricity grid is the biggest machine on Earth. The US used to have the biggest one, now China does. There's a lot of big numbers in there, but the numbers that I think are most telling are, if you think about electricity, it runs through 400 in the United States, 476,000 miles of transmission lines, 55,000 substations, and 6.3 million miles of distribution lines. It is giant infrastructure project, the biggest infrastructure project the United States has ever undertaken, and it takes a lot to operate and maintain. Typically, and historically, the grid kind of functions like you see on the screen. We put some big generators out in the country and run lines, electricity flowed in one direction to all of us here. It was built and maintained predominantly by electric utility monopolies. Those could be for-profit companies like investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities that are managed by cities, and cooperative utilities, which are private organizations that are predominantly funded through low interest loans through the USDA Rural Utility Service. Um, for investor-owned utilities, the monopolies invest money and enjoy a protective rate of return on their capital investments, and they're subject to state regulation. So unlike the roads, which are publicly owned, when you look at all of the power lines outside, all of those are privately owned. So we depend on electricity, on private companies for our electricity system. Okay, so generators generate electricity. The vast majority of generators out there are basically some assemblage of magnets and copper that spin around each other to create electricity, powered by some sort of combustion coal, natural gas, nuclear that turns water to steam and turns the generator, powered by wind in a wind turbine that turns the generator, or in the case of solar, direct current electricity powered by the sun. Um, is my head in the frame? Uh, well, you're gonna have to. You want me to get rid of my head here? Let's do
So
that.
sorry. Yes, please.
Oh, I'm disappeared out of the frame so you can see it all. Um, so all of those generators work and operate. They are then the electricity from those generators are bought and resold by utilities or by private entities, and then delivered to us. You'll see from wholesale to retail, delivered to us in the retail market through a tariff, which is a fancy name for a contract that you didn't negotiate with your utility. How do these wholesale markets work? The wholesale markets are relatively recent invention in the electricity system, starting in the 1970s with the energy supply shocks and then increased prices that were coming from electricity. A number of legislative efforts created these competitive wholesale markets that work through auctions to buy available electricity. The auctions are competitive and they're used to secure not only like real-time electricity, but also secure forward or future electricity. The most important thing to know about these auctions are that they're clearing price auctions. So the wholesale market auctions are very complicated. The grid operators do a lot of work. There's a lot of different attributes, which we'll talk about a few of them that are bought and sold in the auction. But basically, when you think about the electricity that's purchased, what you'll see in this chart here is that the price is on the y-axis there, up at the vertical axis, and the quantity is on the x-axis. And the more quantity that is needed in any given time, the higher the price. And that is because there is a limited amount of electricity available in the system. So the way the auction works is if we need 100 megawatts of power at any given time, and wind comes in and says, I can give you 40 megawatts of power in this chart, for example, at, I believe that says $20 or $30 a megawatt hour. They're first to bid and first to bid to be accepted. But there's not enough wind to satisfy the whole 100 megawatts. So then you purchase solar and natural gas, and everything gets more expensive. And when the auction is satisfied, whatever the price that's paid, whether that be to coal or to nuclear or to peaking gas or whatever is available, that is the clearing price and everybody gets paid. Now, the outcomes here are really if we use a less electricity at any given time, then we pay less. And the more that we use, the more that we pay. What is happening currently, which we'll talk about, is there is a limited amount of energy, electricity in the system. There is a very high demand. So wholesale prices are skyrocketing. Today's report was they're up 125% from just a week ago. And that is because there's a limited amount of electricity, a high amount of demand, and the clearing price is high. So that means that everybody's paying a lot for wholesale price because we're using a lot of electricity because it's very cold outside, and there's a limited supply because when it's very cold, some generators go offline. So when you think about the wholesale power market, there really is a number of different attributes that are being sold. We were just talking about energy delivery. That's like megawatt hours. That's actual electricity, energy. There's capacity. The markets also bid on capacity that is reserve capacity to meet increased demand. So we overbuild in the system because we forecast that maybe we don't need it now, but we might need it if. And so we are currently in one of those might need it if moments. And the big question today in PJM territory anyway is have we reserved enough capacity to meet the highest energy load and electricity demand that we've ever seen forecasted as what they call the winter peak? In addition, wholesale markets also need transmission, so we need to make sure that we can deliver that electricity, and then other services that include voltage and frequency regulation. And all of those are bid through the wholesale markets. There are a number of wholesale markets in the country. They're not organized in a way that you would consider like geographically relevant to you. You'll notice, for example, the Midwest Independent System Operator, or MISO, is kind of like this patchwork of markets that goes from Louisiana to Canada. PJM, which actually serves the most electricity of any market. You see it kind of like jumps into Illinois in the northeast corner there and runs through the east. There's also ERCOT, which is mostly a Texas market, CAISO, which is mostly a California market, and all of these run their own independent wholesale markets. Now, we're going to look at some actual real-time supply from last week, which represents relative winter peak. This week will be even a higher peak. And then we'll look at summer loads in three different markets. Before we do, the question might be, how do we know, like if everything is built in a market or everything is purchased through a market, how do generators know what to build? Because if you build something that's too expensive, then you won't be able to sell it in a market because it will be more expensive than everything else. So how do utilities and private companies like decide on what to build? Well, they generally use a determination called a levelized cost of energy, right? What is going to be the most affordable electricity source that we can build to deliver the electricity when it's needed? The levelized cost of energy helps make an apples to apples comparison because you could take, for example, a solar PV system where it's all capital costs up front. Actually, the interest rate is the most, like the actual steel and materials, and plus the interest rate, if you're doing lending, are the most important thing because the fuel is free. To say a natural gas plant, which you have to build a plant, but then you also have to purchase natural gas for the foreseeable future. And so there is an unpredictable fuel cost. Well, how do you compare those two things? That is the levelized cost of energy. What you'll see in this chart is up top and kind of like the darker grayish blue segment, those are all renewable sources. The bar graphs represent an estimate of what price range do we think that these sources can deliver at, from the lowest price being on the left-hand side of the screen to the highest price being on the right-hand side of the screen. And then you can see the fossil resources on the bottom. This chart also considers fuel price variability, which you'll see in the fossil resources. Like, if fuel's cheap, could it be cheaper? If fuel's more expensive, could it be more expensive? So they're kind of estimating that we're going to get to how quickly these things can be built. We're just talking about the price at this point. Um, so what you'll notice here is from the top, you're looking at commercial and residential PV. Those, it's kind of a not quite apples to apples, because those are built by private individuals on their homes or businesses and deliver electricity at the point of use, so that they can be more expensive and still be very competitive, because you're in a retail market, not a wholesale market. But if you look at the next one, like solar PV, photovoltaics, like utility scale, it's pretty much the cheapest thing on this chart. You can also look at the next one, which is solar PV, solar photovoltaic, solar with storage, still very affordable. And then wind, also probably the cheapest thing on the market, wind plus storage and offshore wind. And then you can compare that to the fossil resources, which is like the peaking gas plants, which um, it's interesting. The combined cycle, oh yeah, gas combined cycle is all the way at the bottom. You can see that that can be, if fuel prices are low, just as affordable as wind in certain instances. But the peaking gas is very expensive. We'll talk about peaking, but also nuclear, one of the most expensive sources, and coal, also really quite expensive. And so the question becomes, like, if you have an expensive generating asset, how are you selling it? Well, let's look at some of the actual supply curves from the wholesale markets and talk about it. So this is our territory. Remember now, this is a territory that runs from Louisiana all the way to Canada. So you can't really make a geographic kind of determination based on what you see, because there are many states and many utilities happening, but they're all purchasing power. So what was our supply last year, peak summer days, June 19th to the 20th? Well, what you see, and this will be common in all of the supply curves that we look at, let me just first say this is 2 days. And so what the first thing you'll see is two humps. And that is because we use more electricity in the middle of the day. That is called the peak time. Prices are higher in peak times because you need more of the electricity. And we already talked about the wholesale markets. The more that you need, the more it's going to cost, right? And so one of the strategies is always to reduce the peak, right? Or satisfy the peak with cheap sources of electricity. And so you'll see these two peaks, because all of these charts will be 2 days, because I wanted you all to see kind of like 2 days. So this is the middle of the summer, MISO. We'll start from the bottom. This will be common in all the graphs. Nuclear. Nuclear is like the base chord, always. Always operating consistently, high capacity factor, underwriting the entire electricity supply. Above that, you'll see coal, natural gas, wind. In this, in MISO, you'll see imports. These are electricity supply that we import from another wholesale market. We're purchasing from another wholesale market because we need it, because we don't necessarily have enough supply or have enough reserve capacity. And then solar and other. And other can be hydro, it can be biomass, it can be trash combustion, whatever, diesel generators, all kinds of different things that contribute in the MISO territory. What I first want to point out is that the solar in the MISO territory, what you'll note is it's mostly hitting the peak time, right? And solar is a good asset because it basically reduces peak electricity. Another thing I'll point out is that when you look at the wind really operates kind of like baseload power, like coal and like natural gas, because the wind turbines are very large and it's very geographically dispersed. So it's always windy somewhere, and it's mostly always windy 250 feet in the air. So the modern turbines are pretty much always turning, they operate at baseload power. Um, but what we'll start to notice is solar in particular starts to miss the peak at some points. So now let's look at winter. So summer, clear, very clear peaks. You can see why in the middle of summer, it's hot during the day. People are running the air conditioning during the day, not so much at night. So you're seeing this kind of like peak use, easy profile. But what about winter? Winter looks a bit different, right? That is because winter heating happens all day long. And what you're kind of seeing in winter every day is these morning peaks and afternoon peaks and kind of like a little lull during the day. Pretty similar profiles. Solar still kind of valuable in that middle of the day. Um, and one of the things, like one of the goals of a grid operator is to not have big peaks of requirements for any typical electrical source because it's hard to kind of like cycle on and off a power plant. It becomes really expensive and those like peaks become expensive. And so what you see is the one source that's cycling in the MISO territory is coal. You'll see that coal is having these cycles. Gas is mostly uniform. Wind is mostly uniform. Sols happen at the middle of the day, but coal is kind of like peaking. It's providing that kind of like extra power during those peak times. And that's a lot of, so we're going to talk about coal, but just wanted to point that out. Okay, now let's look at Texas, ERCOT. Um, so in ERCOT territory, you're starting to see again, now we're back in June in Texas. Now look at the solar deployment in ERCOT. What you'll notice here, which is different, is that now you're starting to see this purple that's right next to the solar. That's actually energy storage. And why would they be deploying energy storage? Well, look at this blue in this supply curve. Look at how natural gas needs to ramp up. Now, notice where it ramps up. It ramps up pretty severely when the sun goes down in the afternoon and where the power demand goes up in the late afternoon. And that becomes a very expensive proposition to kind of like ramp up that much gas usage. And so the idea here is to store and spread out that solar peak or wind or whatever you want to put in storage to decrease those ramp up and those cycles because those become really expensive. And so that's the Texas supply curve. And then let's look at the winter time. Again, pretty different. You're going to see a similar pattern where you still have a peak in the middle of the day, but there's a bit of two kind of other peaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And you'll notice, you'll see how Texas is starting to deploy storage to even out those shoulders on the pink, but still a significant amount of ramping up of natural gas. Just look right here, for example. Right here, look at this curve here, this late afternoon curve, like peaking gas, right? That is a significant difference of gas electricity generation from here to here. And that is exactly where Texas is starting to deploy energy storage to take care of that peak. Okay, now we're going to get into very interesting wholesale supply curve, which is California. Look at California from June 19th to 20th this year. What will you notice? A tremendous amount of solar energy deployed here in the middle of the day. Let me make a note here. This solar energy that's deployed here, this isn't residential and commercial. This is all utility scale because the residential and commercial solar energy is just acting as an efficiency appliance. It's just reducing use during those peak times. And so the more residential and commercial solar, and now residential commercial solar plus storage that you'll see is the lower the peak, right? Because it's just we're using less electricity at that time. So all of this is utility scale solar. Look at the quantity of utility scale solar. Here is what you'll want to notice here in this supply curve. Look at the tremendous amount of energy storage being deployed here. So you're basically taking excess solar, putting it in batteries and deploying it right here at the end of the day. And what you'll notice in California at least in the summer, is there's they almost have it so there's no peak here in the natural gas. There is a significant increase from here to here, but much less severe than Texas. And what you'll notice is all of that is due to storage deployment in the late afternoon. The same thing happens, exact same thing happens the following day. What about in the wintertime? You'll see in the wintertime now, this energy storage is more deployed in the morning and the afternoon. And you'll see a much more even gas distribution, right? This is all imports. California is importing a lot of energy. You also see they have large hydro, significant amount of nuclear still, very diverse power source in California wholesale markets. Okay, we're going to jump to retail electricity. So before we do, what are our takeaways here? Well, one, wholesale markets are competitive. The cheapest electricity wins first, but usually all are needed because it's a limited system. It's a closed system. There's only so many electrons in it. There are peaks. Satisfying that peak is an expensive proposition. Solar produces mostly on peak, but large deployments of solar can cause what they call the duck curve, this major ramp up that's needed at the end of the day. That is increasingly being deployed, being satisfied with energy storage. California is ahead of the curve on solar deployment. And you can kind of see the differences in grid territories. All of this comes from a website that you can go on and create a free account. That's called gridstatus.io. Gridstatus.io. You can see all kinds of fun stuff there, learn more about electricity, learn how all the markets operate. But now let's talk about retail electricity. We can take questions here later, but I want to now make this point about retail electricity. Look at this pie chart here. What you'll notice when you look at what makes up the cost that we pay, right, as a ratepayer, is that the wholesale price is really only 35% of the cost. Traditionally, now, when costs of wholesale electricity go up 125% and consistently go up 125%, then it may be that that portion of the retail electricity is greater and greater. It can produce 50% of the bill. But you'll notice that the biggest cost in retail electricity is delivery because we pay for all of the infrastructure, all of the distribution lines that basically serve our needs. So we pay for the delivery, we pay for the wholesale cost, we pay for all the taxes and surcharges, and we pay for like the middlemen, the purchasing, all of the people that have to buy and sell retail electricity. How are the rates set? Through a tariff. We talked about tariffs. Tariffs are just a fancy word for a contract you didn't negotiate. The utility and the commission, the regulatory body in the state, the Public Utility Commission, set the tariffs for retail, commercial, industrial customers. They propose, you'll see kind of on the right hand of this slide, the process at the Minnesota Public Utility Commission, which is the utility files a rate petition. There's an administrative review and process in the hearings. There's public hearings hosted by a judge. There's evidentiary hearings that all the interveners and the utility and all the interest groups kind of submit evidence and negotiate. Everybody files legal briefs. Judge reviews, make a recommendation. The Public Utility Commission takes all the information, decides on what the rates are going to be, right? Inside of that tariff, that rate proposal will be how much fixed cost you pay every month, the price you'll pay for energy, if you have time of use energy, which many utilities are moving to because it's just more expensive. Like we talked about in the wholesale markets, electricity is more expensive in the middle of the day. So they'll decide on what costs per what time of day. If you're a commercial and industrial customer, and sometimes even a residential customer, your demand charge, if you exceed any expected use of electricity, you'll be charged for that. Some utilities are advancing proposals that are minimum bills. So like with the rise of solar energy adoption and energy efficiency, they're saying like, hey, you have to pay a minimum bill because we're paying to deliver even the little electricity you use. You're still relying on the grid. So there's a minimum bill you have to pay. Net metering, what rate you will be charged uh, or compensated for if you have a solar electric system, and what requirements are there for the interconnection of a solar electric system or an energy storage system. Um, all of this is approved by the state utility regulatory body. If you're in an investor-owned utility, if you're in a cooperative utility or a municipal utility, those are often approved by your local body, which would be your cooperative utility board or your municipal utility committee. What about competition, right? If all of the utilities are monopolies and we're not customers, we're ratepayers because customers have choice and we don't, where is the competition in the system? Well, we talked about it in the wholesale market. Because of federal intervention, we now have the public PURPA. I'm spacing on the acronym Public Utility something. I don't know, PURPA, I forget, Regulatory Protection Act. So that legislation allowed for private generators to bid into the system. That is how we got most of our hydropower in this country. It's how the wind industry started. There are a lot of merchant generators out there that the utilities who have a monopoly over the transmission system and the distribution system and the energy system at large would not connect previously. Now they have to connect and pay the PURPA avoided cost rate. So that makes competition in the system because the higher the costs, the more merchant generators come in to produce power. The wholesale markets, which are these auctions, now we have demand response, which is basically the negawatt. So you can imagine if we go back on these supply curves, if you can imagine a program where instead of satisfying, right, instead of having to deploy peaking gas here or storage, if we were paid just to use less electricity, right? Um, right here, instead of paying for this ramp up of gas or paying for this storage or paying for these imports, us as customers just reduced the amount that we used, the negawatt, and got paid for it, just like we would pay a generator. Then you could pay customers in the system to use less electricity. That is called demand response. That creates competition in the system because it allows homes, businesses, factories to use less electricity and be paid for it. And now coming to a wholesale grid near you is DER aggregation, where you can do the same with a whole host of solar and solar plus storage systems called virtual power plants, where you can do the exact same thing. You can reduce your use in the market and even sell grid services and energy from the distribution system to reduce the purchases of power. Demand response is not in every state. Our aggregation is just starting to roll out, so we expect to see that, for example, in MISO in a number of years, hopefully 2028. In the retail system, energy efficiency is our competition, and solar and energy storage. Because think of this. If you buy a solar PV system and you put it on your home or business and electricity prices go up, well, your system is more valuable because you're reducing your purchases of electricity costs. So the more that electricity prices go up, the more valuable energy efficiency and solar energy investments become. And that becomes competition in the system because the customer has more and more choice to reduce electricity as electricity prices increase. And energy management. You can now manage buy a system for your home and business that manages your energy in a way that reduces your purchases of power on peak times, that automatically turns lights off, that deploys energy storage in a way that avoids peak power purchasing. All of these kind of things are basically the only competition that we have in the electricity system. Okay, we're getting there. We're almost through the basics. Um, I'm trying to advance my slide, but I have the spinning wheel of death here. We'll see. Can you all still hear me? Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right. Um, this is what kind of a representation of what this new grid looks like. Remember the old grid? Big power plant somewhere out in a rural area, lots of transmission, distribution lines. That still exists. But now customers, my house, this business, your businesses are putting solar, energy storage, energy management assets. We're self-supplying. We are reducing the electricity transmission and distribution system delivery because our oversupply goes to our neighbors. And now, through demand response and DER aggregation, we're also supporting the wholesale market. This is kind of a vision of the smart grid. This is where the grid is going. FERC has already passed all the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's basically the national grid regulator. They are the national court for grid disputes, and they have come out with orders that clear the pathway for this new grid, which brings all of us that used to be ratepayers more as participants and investors in the system. This gets enabled by state legislation and by grid operators advancing these orders. So we're going to see a lot of this, for example, in PJM territory and Illinois in the Midwest. Okay, we're going to get to sources now. We got a question about how long does it take to build this stuff? Let's talk about it. But first, we're going to talk about kilowatts and megawatts and kilowatt hours and megawatt hours. Kilowatt is a measure of capacity, how big something is, right? And the kilowatt hour is a measurement of energy. How much electricity is it producing? If you have a solar PV system that is 1 kilowatt and the sun is not shining, it is producing 0 kilowatt hours, right? If you have a megawatt, or let's say a 100 megawatt facility, coal, natural gas, nuclear facility, more like 600 megawatt, and it's operating at a 95% capacity factor, well, then it's probably producing 95% of that capacity as electricity. And so we're just going to go through these terms because you're going to start seeing them here pretty soon. So let's talk about where we get our electricity in the United States. So you'll see over here in this first graph here, it starts in 2021. This is the full stack, right, of our annual power sector generation by source. You can see nuclear, coal, natural gas is the leading source of electricity generation in the country, hydropower, solar, and wind. But then you can also see the trends over time. You'll notice that natural gas additions peaked in 2023. Coal has been on the decline. Nuclear has been on the decline. Natural gas, I'm sorry, this is nuclear. And the only sources that you'll see that have been increasing on this chart are solar and wind. Okay, just remember that. This is additions and subtractions. So new builds and retirements. Left side, retirements. Right side, new builds. You can see all the different electricity markets here. You can see across the board, the vast majority of things that are being retired are coal. There are some gas retirements, some nuclear retirements, and you can see the vast majority of things that are getting built are solar, wind, gas, and some potential nuclear here. This is this is like probably the Palisades reopening. This is Plant Vogtle here. Plant Vogtle is the first power plant we built from scratch in the last 30 years. We're going to talk about that. So let's start with natural gas. Natural gas, as I mentioned, is the largest fossil source of electricity in the U.S. and the largest source of electricity in the U.S. It's produced in the U.S. and Canada and transported by pipeline. We saw in the levelized cost of energy curves that prices for peaking gas plants are much more expensive than the combined cycle gas plants. And so that's really important to understand, kind of like the peak energy pricing. There are already price increases and forecast significant price increases due to the liquefied natural gas exports, which we're going to talk about. They take about 3 to 10 years to construct, and I will note that some new plants in the United States are now being built without pollution controls. That's never happened in my lifetime, but it is happening now. Here is a chart of LNG exports. There are kind of these three countries that are playing in LNG exports. A lot of this has been spurred by the war in Ukraine and Russia. What did everybody bomb first? Energy infrastructure, gas pipelines. Europe needs gas. And so what you'll see is Qatar has built some LNG exports. They're increasing. Australia has built some LNG exports, but who is building the most? The United States is a big priority of the gas industry and the Trump administration. We're going to talk about why. Coal, declining, as we said, but still a critical source of electricity in the U.S., very critical. It's produced in either Western or Eastern U.S. and shipped by rail, two different types of coal. High costs of coal generation have reduced profitability and led to kind of like widespread closures. What is driving the closures of coal plants? Cheap natural gas. Most closed plants were using the eastern bituminous coal. So when you look at coal closures, you're not seeing a lot of plants that are using the lignite that comes from the west. You're seeing a lot of plants closed that were using the bituminous coal from the east. That makes this a big political issue in some eastern states. There's a current federal effort to extend the life of these existing plants. And then little, if any, there's not many proposals for new construction of coal plants, I guess, currently. You can kind of see this gradual decline of coal here starting in 2011. Very significant. And there's an effort here, right, to kind of like save some of these coal plants and extend their lives. We're seeing some of that happen, but the economics are pretty brutal for coal in the electricity system. Nuclear. U.S. has the largest and oldest fleet of nuclear plants in the world. The vast majority of nuclear plants are at the end of their initially permitted life. The closures, again, nuclear is an interesting generation asset and unique, very, very important to the United States. It is a generally carbon-free source of electricity, but they are very expensive to operate and maintain. And so the high cost of nuclear power, again, have led to some closures. We haven't built much nuclear power in the last 30 years. We built one plant, and that plant we'll talk about is it cost twice as much as predicted and was many years behind schedule. That's Plant Vogtle in Georgia. There's a lot of talk about small modular reactors, but they have very major technical and economic barriers. Not a single one operating in the U.S. NuScale tried to advance one with this tri-state agreement out west, but by the time pencil came to paper, it had tripled in cost. And they abandoned the project. There is one operating in Russia. There's one operating in China. There supposedly will be one in the EU. But there are significant challenges to these small reactors. So I wouldn't pin my hopes on small modular reactors anytime soon, kind of like supplying a significant amount of electricity to U.S. grid. Maybe we'll do a presentation just on that. These take 10 plus years to construct, whether they're small or big. We don't actually know how long it takes to build a small modular reactor because we've never built one. Okay, here's these three charts I think are very kind of descriptive of like the state of nuclear. First, you can see starting in 2013, kind of this like begin to decline here in 2017, our capacity because of closures. You'll also see, though, the capacity factor has increased. That is because nuclear is a very expensive plant to build, but the fuel source is relatively cheap to operate. So the way that you make money with a nuclear plant is running it as much as possible. And so what you'll see is starting in 2013, the capacity factor of these plants increasing because the more you run it, the more electrons you sell, the more you can recover those infrastructure costs. So that's interesting. But then you'll just see, regardless of running these plants as much as possible, increasing the capacity factor, the net generation has just um, dipped because of plant closures, the reduction in capacity. Wind. Wind's the most affordable electricity on the grid. Currently, Iowa in the Midwest gets 70% of its electricity from wind and has the cheapest electric rates of any state in the Midwest. There is significant local resistance to wind in states like Wisconsin. A lot of that is, like wind is easier to build in very large, open, flat land full of farms with few people living there. Lots of people do not like the aesthetics of wind farms. They don't want them next to them. There's a lot of resistance. That has been an increasing challenge for wind deployment. They do require significant transmission to kind of deliver that cheap electricity to, you'll notice in the next slide, like where the wind is being built isn't where the population centers are. Large turbines and large geographical distribution of wind have it function like baseload power. You can see that in the supply curves in the wholesale market. It's functioning just very similar to like coal or natural gas, and they're very quick to build, 1 to 2 years. You'll see that the vast majority of wind in the United States, the majority of it comes from 4 states. Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Kansas. These states have deployed a lot of wind. It's a lot of cheap electricity, not where the population centers are. Okay, solar. Solar is unique in that it doesn't use a generator, right? It produces DC electricity and uses an inverter to invert that direct current into grid quality alternating current. Um, Produces when the sun shines. It's also unique because there aren't coal plants in your backyard, or nuclear plants, or natural gas plants, or really even wind turbines. But solar is available to all customers. And so residential solar has been very, very popular. Basically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but financial savings drive the purchasing. Uh, Energy independence, resilience when you add storage, and it's efficient because it produces electricity at the point of use. Our grid is very wasteful. 67% of the energy put into it is rejected because it takes a lot of losses to combust and distribute power. And so when you produce electricity at the point of use, it's much more efficient. It has more value to the customer. That is the same for commercial solar. Commercial solar is very similar. Most commercial solar is purchased in different ways than residential solar through whether it be a commercial loan or a lease. Also, commercial solar often is outside of net metering based on the utility policy. So much of it is used based on the building use at any given time. Businesses purchase it because it lowers operational costs, protects against energy price volatility. It's also good signaling, corporate responsibility, and again, produces electricity at the point of use. Community solar is a bit different, requires enabling policy because community solar allows any ratepayer with a meter where there is a policy in the utility territory or in the state that allows for it to invest in an offsite solar facility and get the production value of their investment mediated on their electricity bill as energy savings. The utility has to be a partner in that. They usually have to be forced to be a partner in that. It's driven through subscriptions and kind of like the payment. All of those laws are different. There's a bill in Wisconsin to do it. Minnesota has the most successful program in the country. Co-ops and some investor-owned utilities have advanced their own programs. It's a great program because it's very simple, very efficient. Uh, Businesses love it. Municipalities love it. Schools, hospitals, universities love it because you don't have to build infrastructure on your site. You can invest offsite in a solar farm, reduce your electricity bill. That has been the story of Minnesota Community Solar. Lots of business savings and business investment. Now we're kind of getting into the large scale solar, which is what really drives a lot of conversations at local jurisdictions. We're going to start with kind of like this concept of agrivoltaics because we'll kind of address this a little bit. That's basically, could you take this capital intensive calcified industry that we know of as agriculture and this capital intensive calcified industry that we know as energy and have them work together to create agrovoltaics? How do you develop an energy resource that not only produces electricity, but facilitates land management and agricultural products? This is UW-Madison has a campus in Wisconsin that is showcasing this. There's demonstrations all over. There are actual solar projects that do this. Big questions about crop production. Can you graze cattle? There's a bunch of big research topics here. Very, very promising area to both preserve farmland and generate electricity. Lots of work needs to be done here, but very, very promising. Utility scale solar, big solar, right? We've seen it in Wisconsin. We have a ton of it being proposed and a ton of it being built. Right here where I sit in Portage County, there's 1.3 gigawatt facility that's actually two projects and one's very large. Um, so these are transmission interconnected projects, right? They connect into the high voltage transmission system. They are developed by private developers, but ultimately owned by the utility, either as outright owners or through long-term power purchase agreement. And they're basically just large generation assets, very similar to other generation assets. Um, I think the benefits are pretty significant when it comes to the financial development or opportunities for local jurisdictions, especially in Wisconsin with our energy aid formula that can be very significant in Portage County, for example. That one project or two projects, that's 1.3 gigawatt project, will increase the county's tax levy by 10%. That is revenue that can go into roads, police, fire, school, whatever the county wants to go into. Energy efficiency and solar energy deployment on county-owned facilities could also be another place you put that money to protect against future price increases. This is a big economic development opportunity, but it also comes with some significant public pushback, as we have seen, and some needs for the county and the local jurisdictions to protect themselves. Before we get there, though, let's zoom out. Now that we kind of understand the basics of the generation assets, what's happening out there? What is really driving the future? Okay, the first is we're going to see continued cost declines, solar and energy storage. One, this is a complicated graph, but basically what you need to see here is all of these are different types of solar cells. And this is the history of their efficiency, like how efficient they are at converting this solar radiation into electrical current. You'll notice a consistent trend of more and more efficient. And this is a relatively old chart, but we're seeing some very significant increases over here. There is just a constant, like more electricity with the same amount of space, right? That means more electricity per like unit of investment. Beyond that, this the the capacity for deployment, the supply chains, the cost of components have driven down costs for utility scale, commercial, and residential solar. This is up till 2024. We are going to see continued cost reductions. The United States is still one of the most expensive places to build solar. It's much more affordable to deploy solar in the European Union. Most countries, in Australia in particular, we're learning how to do it more. You're going to see continued cost declines here. Um, and the same goes for battery storage. You will see here the cost of batteries, right? Precipitous drop and the quality and efficiency based on the energy density of batteries. Will be continued breakthroughs in energy storage. Energy storage, when paired with solar, makes it basically can make it a grid forming asset instead of a following asset. Right now, the inverters just follow the grid, so they can basically help harden the grid, and serve more like baseload power. So this is going to be a trend that we're going to see continue. Another like real interesting point about solar is that if you look at all of the different, from an investment perspective, all of the different energy generation assets, you see a spectrum on two sides of risk. The riskiest thing to build, nuclear power plants, by far, not even close. The least risky thing to build, solar. Solar is a very simple construction project. It's modular, scalable, minimum moving parts, no fuel cost. This is a global survey of like all of the generation assets, and by far, solar was the least risky, with nuclear being the most risky. So when you kind of compare the declining costs, the increasing usefulness, the like expectation of continued fuel price increases, the fact that solar has no cost and it's the least risky asset to build, federal policy be damned, you're going to see a bunch of solar be built pretty much everywhere. Data centers. Okay, we ready to talk about data centers? Let's just start kind of like with an overview. This is like the Colossus 2 data center in Tennessee. If you're interested, you can look that one up. That's an interesting and controversial data center. But a couple things to know when you start looking at kind of like the details of data centers. First, the number of data centers doesn't really matter because it's really the type of data center that matters. Data centers have been everywhere. It's the new type of data center that's being built, which are called hyperscale data centers, and in some ways wholesale data centers, which are data centers that are kind of like basically like rented out for use, or just large data centers that many people could use. Those wholesale and hyperscale data centers are this new type of data center that is really, really presenting challenges to the grid because they represent a very large load, like electricity load like we've never seen before. So the deployment of those, that's what's kind of like really driving the conversation. There are more questions than answers on energy use because there is a similarity between data centers and global oil reserves. Is the only thing that you really know is that everybody's lying about it, right? We don't know how much oil Saudi Arabia has, or Iran, or Qatar, or UAE. We know what they tell us they have. We can expect that, maybe we can estimate what they have, but it's a strategic advantage to not be clear about how much oil you have and how much oil you can produce. This is a similar thing, it turns out, with data centers. They're cloaked in secrecy, which we'll see. They represent the largest new energy load that the US grid maybe has ever seen, based on, I guess, what they're telling us. The development deals are also cloaked in secrecy, which we'll also see shortly. And there is no federal regulation. So if you trust that your utility commission and your utilities will do you right, then I guess you don't need state regulation. But if you want regulation on these assets, the states need to pass regulation. States across the country are doing that. There are proposals, for example, in Wisconsin, where I live, there are two competing proposals with no clear pathway generally for either proposal. So we'll talk about that and see where it goes. So let's look at some of the data. All right, data centers in the Great Lakes. This is a great study, just came out, Joyce Foundation. You can have this presentation. Just ask, we'll send it to you. You'll notice in every slide, there are links to every source. This one is a very interesting report. So let's just look here. What is this chart telling us? It's saying, okay, there are 4 different types of data centers: crypto, hyperscale, retail, which is the ones that have been around forever, telecom data centers also have also been around forever. You'll see that these like retail and telco data centers, they really don't change. They're about the same. Crypto has peaked, thank God. But what you'll really see here is the biggest growth here is in hyperscale data centers and wholesale data centers, right? And so what you'll see is an expectation of a nearly tripling of the amount of electricity demand uh, in the next 5 years from data centers in the Great Lakes. Where are they being built? Here is the number of data centers by year per state in the Great Lakes region. So you can see a lot of new data centers going in Illinois, in the PJM territory, in Ohio, but everywhere is set to see an increase. What mostly matters, though, is how much electricity they're going to use. If you read this report, they're basically like, we don't know because nobody tells us anything. The energy companies like say one thing. So here's the thing you got to know. Utilities love the idea of data centers because utilities make what? They make protected rates of return on their capital investment. So that if they have a new large energy load customer that can justify a whole bunch of new substations and power lines and generators, then they get to invest more money with a protected rate of return. So couldn't you trust what a utility tells you about how many data centers are coming? I will leave that question to you based on their incentives. And the data center companies also don't want to forecast how much electricity they use. So in the report, they'll say it's really hard to know. What we can know is based on kind of like current data centers and current examples and proposals that are out there. And so when they model the electricity forecast, you'll see there is a low, an average, which looks pretty close to a bell curve, and high, which is about as rapid an expansion of electricity use as you can ever imagine. Just look at the difference there between 2025 and say like 2040. You're talking about an extreme increase in electricity use from data centers. And you can see every single state uh, is expected to have some significant amount of growth when it comes to data centers. I don't know what's happening with my computer right now, so I'm going to take a drink of water and we're going to wait and see what happens here. Now would be a good time to type a question into the chat. My computer decides if it wants to keep working.
While your computer figures that out, we did have a question earlier. It's a little off topic, Nick. Someone said my rural electric co-op VP disputes that solar PV is less expensive. He cites subsidies as being misleading and it being classified as quote unquote cheaper. How would you respond?
I mean, sorry, I thought I had put myself as content only there. I guess my face has been here the whole time.
Oh, it's great.
Uh, the response is in God we trust, but everyone else bring data, right? Utilities have been saying this for forever. They've been telling us um, that solar customers cost other customers money, that, you know, natural gas is the cheapest, but prove it. Does your cooperative utility have a study that shows it? If they have a study, that would be great. Who did it? Let's see the methodology. Every time, I mean, I've showed you all the data. This isn't stuff I've made up. This is all public data from all the sources that everybody uses. I'm not using some, like solar industry data or something. This is public data about costs and how it's being delivered. And the reality is that utilities have an incentive to ensure that customers don't use less electricity. So to do that, they'll tell you, oh, solar's too expensive. Solar costs other people money. But the answer is prove it. Every time um, every time it's been studied, independent value of solar studies demonstrate that it saves everybody money. That when I take my money and I put that money on a solar system on my house, that people don't have to pay a protected rate of return on. We don't have to fund the utilities on it. It delivers electricity to my house, produces at peak time, avoids distribution system costs, avoids transmission system costs. That it's a benefit. So study it. That's Let's put our let's put our money where our mouths are. That would be my recommendation. Okay, we're back to working. Good question. Um, this article just came out today. Um, we'll talk about it in a bit, or I should say this chart here on the side. This is like all the proposed data centers in Wisconsin, proposed under construction, paused. There are 7 major projects in the state of Wisconsin. A lot of this is focused on Wisconsin because we're going to be focusing on Wisconsin with this presentation first, but happy to make any Midwest state presentation if you're interested. Uh, 2 projects that we actually have energy use information on um, in Wisconsin. Those 2 projects would use nearly 2 times as much electricity as every single household in the entire state. 2 data center projects. It is a tremendous amount of electricity, and there's a tremendous amount of proposal. What you'll notice is a lot of the proposals are in southeast Wisconsin in We Energy's territory. Okay, we've got some trends. Okay, I'm gonna put myself back up on the screen here so you can see me when we talk about this stuff. Let's talk about some news. Okay, I'm gonna talk with you about some news and we'll apply what we know here to some news articles. So let's see what do we got here. All right. Here's a news article from a few days ago. Natural gas prices soar as U.S. braces for Arctic blast. Okay, this is from a few days ago. It says that natural gas prices jumped 63% now. Today it's 125%. So what does it tell us? We talked about it a little bit. There's a limited supply of electricity in the grid, and when we use more during these very cold times where we're all running our heaters, right? And there's limited supply because natural gas pipelines are freezing, solar panels are covered in snow, whatever it might be, then there's a limited supply. That means prices go up because this is a limited system. This is just an example of kind of how fragile the system is. We talked about, article just came out that PJM territory is bracing for shortness on supply. The grid has a pretty simple operating parameter. Supply must equal demand or failure occurs. When we don't have enough supply, that's when you see rolling blackouts. So we already exist in a fragile system, a system that does not have oftentimes enough electricity to meet demand. So I'll ask you this question. What happens when we just introduce a tremendously large new electricity load that can be built in a year or two? When we just talked about the lengths of time it takes to build new generation, what do you think happens in times like now? Even more interesting, this is that last slide, this headline is always the headline. This is always the headline in big winter storms, right? Here's a new headline. Now, this storm drives global natural gas prices higher. What? How is that possible? How is it possible that in our natural gas market that we use for electricity and local natural gas needs, when there's limited amounts of natural gas, how now is it driving global prices higher? Here's a quote from the article. The Trump administration has largely successfully prioritized the export of liquefied natural gas, with Europe particularly dependent on U.S. supplies after slashing its reliance on Russia. In this article, there is a quote, and it says, when the U.S. national gas market sneezes, the world market gets a cold. What does that mean? That means is that the U.S. is increasingly creating a global market for natural gas. I'll tell you this, natural gas in Europe is about 3 times as expensive as in the United States. So if you have a global market for natural gas because you can liquefy it and ship it over seas, what happens to U.S. natural gas prices? A boom in gas exports is pushing up U.S. energy bills. It's already happening. We're just starting this major build out of liquefied natural gas. So what happens to natural gas prices for electricity when we start exporting to a high-priced market, liquefied natural gas? Electricity prices go up. Okay, let's keep going here. Get away from natural gas. Oh, we're back to data centers, I guess. Um, let me make sure. No, here, let's see. Nope, we skipped one. Oh, here's a good one. Trump administration pushes PJM. All right. Now, we just got notice today that PJM is forecasting that under current conditions, it may have a system-wide blackout because it cannot meet the supply of electricity in these peak winter months. Okay. Well, the Trump administration is pushing PJM to hold emergency auction just to supply data centers. Most importantly, what you'll see here is that the data center build out has been most rapid in PJM. And in the last market, data centers bought nearly half of the 47.2 billion dollars in costs from PJM's last three capacity markets. So data centers are already buying the energy capacity, half of it in the markets. So we have a market that cannot potentially find out. They're signaling they can't even supply for the demand that exists. Data centers are already purchasing half of the future demand in the capacity markets, and now they want their own auction. Here's a good analogy for you to help you understand this. Okay, you run a trucking business. All of a sudden, some new company starts buying half of all of the trucks available in the marketplace, driving up prices for all the trucks. And you're like, hey, what the heck's going on? Like, who is this new person and why are they buying half of all of the trucks that are available and driving up prices? And the trucking company, and for some reason, the federal government has to first say, don't worry, they're going to pay for it all. Why would they not have to pay for it all is the question. This is what happens in the energy market, right? Don't worry, we'll pay for it all. Okay, why wouldn't you pay for it all? What's the option of not paying for it all? But anyway, they're buying half the trucks and they're like, okay, sorry, we bought half the trucks, but we got an idea. We're going to hold an auction just for us so that we can buy all the future trucks. But we'll pay for them all. Don't worry. Okay. So now they're buying half the trucks now, and then they're going to buy all of the future trucks. So how do I get any trucks? If you're buying half the trucks now and you're going to buy all of the future trucks in a special auction for you, then how do I ever get a new truck and how can I afford the trucks now? And most importantly, what about the road congestion? How am I even going to drive my trucks on the road if you bought 50% of the current trucks and then all the future trucks? That is a good analogy for what's happening in the wholesale markets. This article is very, very enlightening if you understand how wholesale markets work. This is an incredible threat. The only way that this doesn't become a threat is if three things happen. The first, data centers pay for all of the new infrastructure that is needed, for all of the new energy use, and they pay for all of the energy that they purchase. That is a tenuous proposition at best. Second, they can build all of this new energy generation in time to actually satisfy this need. And three, we can build all of the new distribution and transmission infrastructure needed for it. I'll ask you to think about what you think the probability of all three of those things coming true is. And it's not stopping, like I said. Not only are the current data centers, one of them being Microsoft, we know two of them, going to use almost twice as much electricity as all households, but they're already proposing expanding it. I heard on the way over here on the news that the Mount Pleasant board just approved the expansion also. At least four Wisconsin, this just came out today. This is a great article. So interesting. At least four Wisconsin communities signed secrecy deals for billion-dollar data centers. Okay. I won't pick on the towns, but basically what happens is some subsidiary called Balloon LLC comes and works with the local Chamber of Commerce to convince them that this is a great deal. Like, what are they getting paid? How are they like making money off of this? Like, what's their interest? They go to the town council. They all sign non-disclosure agreements where they can't talk about any of this stuff. They work on it for a year. They have one town board meeting and they approve it with no public input. This is the model for data center development currently in Wisconsin and many other communities. I already mentioned this, but there are two competing state bills to rein in this kind of data center development, or at least ensure that data centers pay their costs. There's a Republican bill, a Democratic bill. The Democratic bill is like, sure, but you have to pay all your costs and you have to get 70% of the electricity from clean energy, which when you think about two data centers using twice as much electricity, almost twice as much electricity as every house, the question becomes, is that even feasible in any way? This kind of policy is called Bring Your Own New Clean Energy, or Beyonce. Then you have the Republican bill that says you have to pay for most of your energy costs and you can use renewable generation on site, but you can't purchase any renewable generation off site. So just a bill that's basically like you have to use natural gas or coal or something besides solar and wind, which we know solar and wind are the quickest to build and the cheapest to build. These two bills, the challenge with these two bills is that if the Republicans pass one and the governor vetoes it, that's not a bill. And if the Republicans and Democrats don't compromise, the governor won't sign it. That means we have no state regulation. So it's really important for states to get together and pass bills to hit those three things. Pay for all your energy and capacity, build it in time, pay for the transmission in time. Because if not, what we already know, like I said, is PJM can't even handle the current load that we have. Okay, this is an interesting one. We talked about the risk of building new nuclear plants, right? How they're the highest risk asset. Well, if you look at Plant Vogtle, right, they built two reactors in Georgia. They were delayed by nearly a decade. They just came online mostly. They were double the original $14 billion budget. So a 2x cost run, $14 billion more that ratepayers have to pay back plus interest over their life. And to complete the project, Westinghouse filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and Bechtel had to come in and finish the project. So when Trump administration came out with this idea of building a bunch of new nuclear, what did Bechtel say? They're like, hey, we'll build it, but you have to pay for it. The federal government has to step in and risk share because these projects are very difficult to build and very expensive. So now this is a push by an industry to get basically a government bailout for cost overruns. So taxpayer expense plus ratepayer expense. Now, what you may not have kind of discerned from this conversation is that when it comes to rate making, the commission has three stakeholders that they consider in rates: residential ratepayers, commercial industrial ratepayers, and or commercial ratepayers and industrial ratepayers. Industrial ratepayers, especially data centers, have big lobbies, right? They can be on the Capitol, they can lobby utility, etc. Commercial ratepayers, similar. They have, associations and groups. What about residential ratepayers? Who is advocating for the residential ratepayer and making sure that we're not just shifting costs onto residential customers because they don't have a voice at the Capitol? They're just the little guys. Well, it's usually a citizens utility board or some advocacy group or an attorney general or something that is like fighting for ratepayers because the regulatory requirement is no cost shifting. Don't burden residential customers. The problem, as illustrated in the second article I linked in here, is that this is really about influence. If I had you raise your hand, right? And I asked you this question: do you trust in our current climate that regulators can effectively do their job and regulating very wealthy and influential corporations? Would you say yes, or would you say no? And if I ask you a second question, is this improving the current status or getting worse? How would you say it? Read Power Brokers. That's what this is all about. The utility industry has made money the same way for a century. They have a tremendous amount of influence. And what we see then is stuff like this. Home electricity bills are skyrocketing, but not so much, it turns out, for commercial and industrial customers. How come when you look at residential bills, you see this dramatic increase for all of us households, but somehow industrial customers has figured out how to cap and even decrease their rates? I've already explained it. I'll let you come to your own conclusions. Okay. We could go on with news forever. I'm probably already past time. You knew this was going to happen. Um, I am 20 minutes over. So much to do. So let's just kind of like go through the end and hopefully I can answer more of your questions. Let's just talk about the development process as we witness through large scale solar. This is something that a lot of communities are dealing with. The first thing that happens is landowner agreements. Developer comes in, same development companies pretty much that have cited like fracking wells all over the country. They come in to negotiate landowner agreements on behalf of a developer to site solar farms. They're profitable deals. They pick the biggest landowners, right? So usually large agricultural landowners, which makes a lot of people mad that are other small farms because it's like the solar farm's developed and it's already the rich farmer that's getting richer, but they're very profitable, like 5 times more profitable per acre per year than your typical agricultural activity. And for 35 to 40 years, and with an escalator, very good for farms because it locks in a source of revenue that is immune from kind of like futures markets. All of that happens outside of the public eye, generally just talked about socially. Nobody really knows what's going on. Then it goes to the local board because there's land use approvals and permitting, and most importantly, joint development agreements. Most of these, however, are state approvals, these projects. They are developed in kind of a quick pipeline through what they call a certificate of public necessity and convenience, because it's a private project, right? It's not a utility project. If it was a utility project, they'd have to go through a whole rate proceeding. But since there's like a handshake agreement between the developer and the utility that the utility is going to be an off-taker at the end, they can go through this quicker process. Now, it's not that quick. There's still a state regulatory process that allows for intervention by towns and cities and other stakeholders. That's an evidentiary hearing that allows for public comment. There's also an environmental review, and then the determination of the utility age shared revenue that comes from the project. Then from the utility side, there's an interconnection, which is an engineering process, and then there's the kind of transition like offtake, so long-term power purchase agreement, or just acquire the whole project. And then sometimes there's also corporate procurement of the assets. So they'll directly buy the power or buy the renewable energy certificates, which is the green, like carbon-free attributes, megawatt hours of electricity. So in this process, what can a community do? I think broadly speaking, they're called community benefit agreements, right? And the goal here is to maximize the local benefit and minimize the local impact. These can take the form of joint development agreements, host community agreements, project labor agreements. For example, I just saw in the City of Milwaukee newsletter today that they negotiated a joint labor agreement for a solar project in Milwaukee where they're going to hire 20% local labor. So making sure that local people are hired. And then these kind of like community benefit plans. All this fits into this negotiation called the community benefit agreement. Most important thing is capacity building at the local jurisdiction. To do this, understanding, having your zoning and your permitting right, having a good board, having an educated board, knowing what you want, um, and then beginning to have these negotiations with developer with support from community groups. Um, these also can be with the right pressure through the public comment period, through intervention, can be an outcome or required outcome of the regulatory approval at the State Utility Commission. Very important. Lots of good resources here, which we'll happily share with you. Easy one. Protect yourself from future price increases through the deployment of energy efficiency and on-site renewables. This is the only competition that we have. Prioritize the highest value, lowest cost. Get an energy audit. get site assessments for solar and energy storage, look into demand response, look into assets that can shift your load called arbitrage. So you're only using electricity at low times. Look at resilience through energy storage deployment, continuous power supply, request for information, get free bids, just free estimates, no commitment, request for proposals. Make sure you do this competitively and access state incentives. Focus on energy in Wisconsin is where all that action happens. And collective advocacy through your state associations, through all, like, first is really easy, public education. This is the most important thing you can do to build kind of the awareness in a local community. All it takes is some local approval. Rate cases, learn to intervene. Work with the county's association, the town's association. Net metering and interconnection, we got to protect our right to produce our own power. Energy efficiency incentives, the commission can always increase that. Integrated resource planning, how about the utility files plans required, the state, 10-year plans, so that we can be educated. This happens in Minnesota, happens in Iowa, happens in Illinois, doesn't happen in Wisconsin. This needs to be passed by the state legislature. We want to understand what's happening. The utilities to have all the information. We need it. Let's transition to performance-based regulation. Instead of getting paid for how much you built, how about getting paid for the services you deliver? Like, if we're going to have monopoly investor-owned control over our electricity system, let's pay them for delivering benefits to us, keeping costs low, keeping the lights on. We need data center regulation. Community solar would be great. And imagine if we had a state green bank that leveraged public and private financing to reduce the costs of purchasing all of these assets on our local units of government and our municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals. We run a Grow Solar program that can help you do the education. You can bring this conversation to your community. You can learn about focus on energy. You can organize with groups in Wisconsin. Oh, sorry I went over. What haven't I missed or what haven't I talked about?
We have a couple miscellaneous questions from
Yes,
the
please.
chat. Some of these were kind of answered in the chat as well, so I welcome people to check out the conversation. One question is, I'm curious as to why small wind turbine development is not further along for residential homes.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with solar. Solar is modular, scalable, um, and few moving parts, measurable, uh, bankable, and small wind energy. Just to, I've heard it explained like it's like putting a piece of farm machinery 120 feet in the air. They require maintenance. Um, and they're just a more expensive proposition and a higher maintenance proposition. So we haven't seen that market take off because of that reason, really. There, solar and wind pair really well together in kind of like an off-grid scenario, but it just hasn't been cost competitive from like a maintenance standpoint.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And then we had one more. Why is Texas so incredibly successful with wind and solar, and Wisconsin is having the problems you mentioned?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Texas has a unique market. They're deregulated, right? So in Texas, so there's vertically integrated or regulated states. So you have like an investor-owned utility that not only owns the generators, but they own like, so they own the energy, but they also own the lines, like to deliver it, all of the infrastructure. In a deregulated state, that's decoupled, like Illinois is also deregulated. So Texas has a deregulated state. They also have an interesting kind of like market approach. Like in the industry, it's called connect and manage. So like if you wanted to take any sort of facility in MISO, like solar or energy storage or wind or gas or whatever, you have to go into the MISO interconnection queue, and there's a bunch of analysis that happens for you to be able to interconnect to make sure that there's grid capacity to do that. And that queue is kind of like as soon as something happens and you're in the queue, like all the costs go on the next person. So there's been a big problem with the MISO queue, just tons of affected projects. Whereas in Texas, it's like a connect and manage. So like they're like, sure, you can connect this project, but if we don't have the transmission availability, it's going to sit there. And so Texas has been able to deploy kind of like in this kind of like Wild West style, unregulated. They've been able to deploy a lot of different assets. Texas has its own problems, of course. Like you saw what can happen in a deregulated market. Like here's two interesting Texas problems. One, you saw like a major grid failure in Texas the last winter storm we had, right? That was like international news. And that is because in a regulated market, you have a lot of this reserve capacity and reserve capacity requirements and a lot more bureaucracy and a lot more studies. So those, it tends to be more expensive, but you see like less like catastrophic failure. The other thing in Texas that happened at that time, and that is probably happening right now, Texas has done a lot after that. And mostly what they did is a bunch of wind, solar, and batteries. That's how they've hardened their grid. So, like, we're going to see how ERCOT weathers a storm. There's going to be some interesting outcomes. A lot of it's going to be like we deployed a lot of renewables very quickly through our kind of deregulated market and our connected manage approach. Um, but another thing, for example, in Texas, a lot of people were signing up for these rates in Texas that was like through an alternative energy supplier, where you're basically paying a retail rate that's directly connected to wholesale price. And so a lot of times you're like, that really works well if wholesale power is selling at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and I'm like buying my retail rate at wholesale times even two, but wholesale times 1.5, I'm paying 6 cents a kilowatt hour. That's less than half as much as we're paying in Wisconsin. However, what happens when wholesale prices go crazy? What happened during the grid outage in Texas is customers that had that rate were getting like $16,000 energy bills for a single month. And so there are definitely risks in Texas. Here's another interesting thing that I would suggest that you watch: data centers. Why aren't all the data centers just going in Texas? Why are they going in Virginia? And why are there so many proposed in We Energy's territory in Southeast Wisconsin? Okay, well, in a connect and manage market, right, you would think that data centers would have a heyday, right? You just connect and then you get energy. But what if it's the case in these kind of deregulated markets where I could build this data center and connect it, but I just can't get energy for it? Or the energy I can get for it is so expensive because the wholesale power price is so expensive because there's just not enough generation assets. Or I'd have to build all my own distribution and transmission infrastructure and energy assets to make sure I had it. That is a real challenge in this market. You actually have to deliver the things that you need for yourself or create partnerships to deliver it. However, wouldn't it be easier if I could just site my data center in a location where the utility basically has captured the commission and can get me a utility rate and secure me power at everybody else's cost? Is a big question. I have reason to watch the news and understand the trends when it's related to energy. Don't know if that fully answered your question, but it is a very good experiment. This like Texas versus California kind of like dynamic is very interesting.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. And it looks like we just have one more question. I love it. It's a little action focused. What is the best way to get employment in this industry, in your opinion? Trade schools, apprenticeship?
I think there are multiple avenues. I think you can, like, my son just graduated high school, wasn't all that interested in college. He just got a job with a solar company, like residential and commercial systems. And the benefit of that, I can see just like through his experience. And of course, we do a lot of this training and support a lot of this, is that for a younger person, he's getting all kinds of skills, all his OSHA, all his equipment, like all his site safety, like working on the DC side, driving equipment, just getting familiar, with, like all the different experiences, roof work, ground mount work, like a very good experience. But he's responsible for his own training. doesn't really make a ton of money, but for him, it's a lot of money. So like just getting experience, he's taking MREA courses, he's taking all the manufacturing courses or the manufacturer delivered courses like that. He's taking the MREA Energy Pro Series courses. So is everybody else at the company he works with. So like just getting out there, getting work experience, figuring out how to dress, show up for work, like just work, see if you like it. That's just one way to do it. Apprenticeship is awesome. Like, if you think about apprenticeship, it didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of like a century of labor strife. This idea of unionizing and negotiating and forming this kind of like large block of laborers that can negotiate benefits for yourself. Like an apprenticeship, electrical apprenticeship is like the gold standard. Getting a job through an apprenticeship program, getting involved with the union, that's great. If you can do that, like trades are the future. Construction, craft laborer. But for the most part, it's just about getting experience. Like MREA courses are accessible, affordable, uh, widely recognized. We are aligned with NABCEP, so going through the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners training, going to a tech school, like just going to a tech school and get vocational training. There's all kinds of good tech school programs out there. So I think there's a range, right? There's like um, we are entering a period where construction, as long as the economy doesn't crater, you never know. But like construction is forecast to be like a very solid employment, and that takes experience, some education, however you get it, tech college or union apprenticeship or non-union apprenticeship. Associated Buildings and Contractors have non-union apprenticeships, still great programs.
Great. Thanks, Nick. It looks like that is all the questions for today. As a reminder to everyone, we'll send out the recording of this along with an email where you can request the resources that Nick included in the presentation. Nick, do you have any other thoughts as we wrap up?
Uh, no, thanks for attending. It's been awesome. Um, I'm trying to stop sharing. Did I effectively do that?
Still sharing, but it looks great.
Okay. And thanks for attending. And we'll see you in the next one. Bring us to your local community. It will be much more dynamic, lots more conversation, and watch for our next webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.